Winter had already settled over northern Germany when the convoy rolled through the gates of Rechlin. The air was brittle, the snow stained with the dust of nearby bombings. Inside the trucks, under canvas covers dusted white with frost, rested something the Luftwaffe had never laid eyes on intact. An American P-38 Lightning. To the soldiers guarding it, it looked like another spoil of war. To the engineers waiting behind the fences, it was something else entirely. A puzzle from another world. The official report would later note its serial number, 42-12652, captured after a forced landing in Italy, February 1943. It had come down nearly undamaged, the pilot taken prisoner before the wreck could be destroyed. The aircraft had been shipped north, examined first by Italian technicians, then turned over to the Germans for evaluation. Now, after weeks of careful transport, it arrived at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret testing facility hidden deep within Mecklenburg's frozen lakes. Rechlin was the beating heart of Germany's aviation science, a place where every new aircraft, every experimental engine, every captured enemy machine was measured, dissected, and flown. Here, innovation and desperation coexisted beneath the drone of test stands and the roar of piston engines pushed beyond their limits. In the thin light of that winter morning, a handful of officers and engineers gathered in heavy coats around the flatbed. Among them was Hans Werner Lersche, one of the Luftwaffe's most trusted test pilots, a man who had flown almost every aircraft Germany had ever built, and soon, nearly every enemy design they managed to capture. As the tarpaulin came off, a hush fell. Before them stood a shape unlike anything built in Europe. Twin booms, a central nacelle, a cockpit like a glass bubble. The Americans had called it the Lightning. The Germans had already given it a nickname of their own, Der Gabelschwanzteufel, the fork-tailed devil. It looked alien. Even on its battered landing gear, its stance suggested speed and confidence. The dull olive drab of its fuselage carried bullet scars, but the lines were sleek, the angles sharp, as though every inch had been shaped by wind itself. Lurch circled the aircraft slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. He traced his gloved hand along the nacelle's edge, pausing over the twin Allison Vi 1710 engines. Their cowlings were scarred, but the engines were largely intact. A miracle. The real prize, though, was buried deeper inside. The General Electric turbo superchargers mounted aft, feeding compressed air through long ducts to sustain power at high altitude. No German piston fighter possessed anything like it. The Luftwaffe's own aircraft relied on mechanical superchargers, compact and efficient, but bound by the limits of altitude and temperature. The P-38, by contrast, carried the sky inside it. At 40,000 feet, it could still deliver full power, its twin turbos singing at nearly 40,000 revolutions per minute. For the engineers at Rechlin, the implications were staggering. Since the beginning of the war, they had struggled to maintain engine performance above 20,000 feet. German metallurgy simply could not produce enough heat-resistant alloys to handle the thermal stresses of turbo supercharging. Even the Junkers Jumo and Daimler-Benz DB series engines, masterpieces in their own right, suffered from material shortages that limited their potential. Now here stood an American engine that defied those limits. The team began documenting everything: measurements, photographs, sketches of the ducting and intercooler layouts. Each bolt and bearing told a story of industrial strength. The Americans, they realized, had achieved something Germany could not: mass-produced precision. The components were not hand-fitted or polished by craftsmen in small workshops. They were machined in factories across the Atlantic, stamped with identical tolerances, interchangeable from one Lightning to the next. The idea that such complexity could be repeated tens of thousands of times was almost unthinkable in wartime Germany, where shortages of copper, nickel, and skilled labor forced compromises in every design. In the cold hangar, one of the engineers, Dr. Helmut Schelp, examined a section of turbine housing under the magnifying glass. "Nickel-chromium alloy," he murmured, "perfectly cast. No porosity," he said it almost with awe. Outside, the wind swept across the frozen airfield. Far above, the distant hum of Allied bombers carried faintly over the clouds. A constant reminder of why these men were here, racing against an enemy that seemed to invent faster than they could rebuild. That night, the lights in the Rechlin workshops burned past midnight. Drawings covered the tables, cross-sections of turbo housings, exhaust manifolds, and control linkages. On one sheet, someone had scrawled a question mark next to the words, exhaust-driven compressor efficiency. On another, a note in pencil. Could this principle apply to JUMO 213? They were not just examining an airplane. They were peering into the future. In Berlin, reports would soon circulate through the Luftwaffe's technical departments. The captured Lightning's performance data astonished even senior engineers at Messerschmitt and Junkers. Rumors spread that elements of its design might influence new projects, high-altitude interceptors, even jet prototypes. But most quietly acknowledged the truth. They lacked the alloys, the fuel, and the time. By February's end, Hans-Werner Lersche prepared to fly the P-38 under German markings. Mechanics repainted its tail with a black cross and white numerals. White 33, the sight of an American fighter, reborn in German colors, unsettled even the veterans at Rechlin. It was as though the enemy had infiltrated their skies. On the morning of the test flight, the airfield was silent except for the crackle of frost beneath boots. Lersche climbed into the cockpit, adjusted the unfamiliar American harness, and studied the instrument panel. The layout was clean, logical, efficient. Every gauge clearly marked in English. He noted the redundancy of systems, dual fuel pumps, duplicate electrical circuits, self-sealing lines. This was not luxury. It was design born of abundance. When the twin Allisons came to life, their note was unlike any German engine, smoother, higher pitched, with a turbine whistle overlaying the growl. As the propellers blurred into silver discs, the engineers watched from the taxiway, their breath fogging in the cold. Lersche throttled forward, the aircraft surging ahead, twin tails carving through the mist. Within seconds, the Lightning was airborne, climbing steeply into the white sky. From below, they watched until it vanished. For a moment, the hangar stood in silence. Then someone spoke quietly. If they can build thousands of those... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Over the next weeks, Lersche and the Rechlin team would chart every aspect of the captured P-38's performance. Its climb rate, roll response, high-altitude stability. They noted its weaknesses too. Compressibility near dive speeds, heavy control forces, cockpit heating issues. Yet none of that diminished the impression left by its engineering. The reports concluded, almost reluctantly, exceptional design, production quality exemplary, range and altitude performance superior to any current Luftwaffe fighter. In the pages of that report lay a quiet confession. For all of Germany's innovation, for all its faith in engineering genius, it was falling behind. Not because its minds were weaker, but because its machines, its materials, and its freedom to experiment had been consumed by a war it could no longer control. The Rechlin engineers did not say it aloud, but they all knew. The P-38 was more than an enemy aircraft. It was a signal, proof that the skies themselves were shifting. The following morning, frost rimed the hangar doors at Rechlin. Inside, the captured P-38 rested in silence. Its olive paint dulled beneath the condensation that bled from the roof beams. Around it, the engineers gathered again, clipboards in hand, the breath from their mouths forming brief clouds that vanished into the cold air. They had spent the night poring over the first flight data. Hans-Werner Lersche's notes were clinical yet reverent. Stable at altitude. Turbo pressure constant. No detonation up to 45 inches manifold pressure. To men accustomed to coaxing life from engines that strained at half that boost, it read like a fairy tale. Now they began the deeper work, the systematic dissection of a foreign mind rendered in metal. Under the glare of portable lamps, technicians removed the left engine cowling. The metallic smell of oil and scorched paint filled the air. They traced each line: fuel, coolant, electrical. One engineer, Oberingenieur Fritz Goebel, called out the alloy codes stamped on the turbo housing, letters that meant nothing to them. American metallurgy used compositions unknown to the Reich's foundries. Where German superchargers relied on delicate machined impellers, the Lightning's General Electric B-Series turbocharger looked almost crude. its castings thick and unpolished, but its durability was undeniable. "This," Goebel muttered, "is made to be copied thousands of times." He said it with quiet respect, not envy. From the mezzanine above, a photographer documented every angle. Each roll of film would be sent to Oberkommando der Luftwaffe for analysis, part of a growing archive of captured technology that by 1943 filled entire warehouses. Rows of British Spitfire wings, American propeller hubs, Soviet engines wrapped in burlap. Yet nothing in those stores equaled the lightning for complexity. Outside, the world was changing faster than any report could be written. U.S. 8th Air Force bombers crossed the North Sea daily, escorted by the very aircraft now sitting in this hangar. The engineers knew it. They could hear them at night, the thunder overhead like distant surf. They worked anyway. Every gasket and fastener was measured, weighed, logged. The intercoolers, two rectangular boxes buried deep in the booms, became an obsession. Their efficiency numbers seemed impossible with the materials Germany had available. The alloy fins were thin as paper, perfectly brazed. When the metallurgists tested a sample, they found traces of nickel and molybdenum far beyond what German industry could spare. Those elements were now reserved almost exclusively for jet turbine blades and submarine parts. "This is where they win," said one of the younger engineers quietly. "Not in speed, in supply." Lurscher returned from debriefing and stood among them, wiping grease from his hands. He described the flight again, slower this time. The effortless climb, the stability at 10,000 meters, the peculiar whisper of the turbos as they spooled up. He had tested the Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, the FW190A5, even the twin-engined Me 210, yet none compared in smoothness or endurance. The Lightning felt industrial, not experimental, a machine built for pilots who would never see its factory. For the first time, some of the engineers felt a fracture between pride and truth. They had been told that German science was unmatched, that foreign designs were crude imitations. But this aircraft contradicted that belief with every bolt. In Berlin, Willy Messerschmitt still promised the Luftwaffe miracles: high-altitude interceptors, new variants of the Me-109 capable of chasing the flying fortresses into the stratosphere. Yet here, in this hangar, the men who built and measured and tested knew those promises were illusions. The Reich's factories were starving. Copper and rubber shipments were dwindling. The bombers came by day and by night. The engineers' notebooks began to reflect that quiet despair. Beside performance figures, marginal notes appeared. Impossible to duplicate alloy, fuel type unavailable, requires precision casting beyond current tolerance. They were not complaints, they were admissions. By the second week, the aircraft had been completely mapped. The Germans gave it a new code, T2-512, category Feingerät, enemy equipment. It joined a growing fleet of captured machines flown by the Versuchsstelle Rechlin and later transferred to Circus Rosarius, the special unit tasked with demonstrating Allied aircraft to Luftwaffe squadrons. Before the transfer, the engineering division held one final briefing. Charts covered the walls, compressor ratios, intercooler efficiency graphs, stress diagrams. At the center, a single sheet bore a question typed in bold. Could a German turbo supercharger be made to match American design? Silence followed. Dr. Schulp answered for them all. Not without materials we no longer have. The phrase would echo long after the war. That afternoon, the Lightning was towed back into the pale sun, its propeller arcs flashing briefly in the light. Mechanics warmed the engines for another test flight. Lurscher climbed aboard once more. From the hangar doors, the engineers watched as the fork-tailed Devil lifted into the frozen sky and turned east, the sound of its turbos fading into the distance. In their reports that evening, they wrote of its stability, its endurance, its flawless systems. But in their hearts, many recorded something else, an understanding that Germany's war in the air was already tilting toward defeat, not through bravery or tactics, but through the quiet arithmetic of production and design. For centuries, wars had been decided by men. In this one, they were learning. It would be decided by machines and by the factories capable of birthing them faster than any engineer could dream. The first glimpse had become revelation, And revelation in wartime was another word for reckoning. By March 1943, the captured Lightning bore a new identity. T-2512, the Luftwaffe's own ghost aircraft. Its once olive skin now carried black crosses and a faint yellow band on the tail, a mark of caution for every German pilot who might mistake it for an enemy. Beneath the new paint, though, it was still entirely American. At Rechlin, the engineers had learned what they could from wrenches and measuring tapes. Now the aircraft's secrets would be revealed only through flight. The duty fell again to Hans Werner Lerch, the man trusted with everything that flew, from the humble Fieseler Stork to the still experimental jet fighters whose engines screamed themselves apart after minutes. The morning was clear, the air sharp and thin. The Lightning's propellers flashed in opposite directions as the Allisons came alive, their turbochargers spooling with the metallic whine that had startled ground crews since the first test. Lerch eased the throttles forward. The aircraft surged down the frozen strip and lifted effortlessly into the sky. Observers on the ground followed it through binoculars, an American silhouette against German clouds. Every maneuver was logged. Rate of climb, roll response, acceleration. The readings defied expectation. At 8,000 meters, the Lightning still climbed, its manifold pressure constant. No German piston aircraft could do the same. Even the high-altitude Bf-109G1 gasped for power beyond 6,000. Over the next weeks, the data multiplied. Fuel consumption curves, coolant temperatures, turbo output, all precise, all remarkable. The technicians compared them to the charts of the DB605 engine powering Germany's frontline fighters. The numbers told a simple story. The Americans had conquered altitude through metallurgy and mathematics, not myth. Soon the aircraft was moved to another field, a secretive unit known as Circus Rosarius, named after its founder, Theodore Rosarius, a former flight instructor turned curator of enemy machines. His circus toured German air bases, demonstrating captured Allied aircraft so that combat pilots could recognize their shapes and tactics. It was a strange spectacle. Spitfires, Mustangs, and Lightnings parked beside Focke-Wulfs, all bearing black crosses, the enemy's wings, borrowed for instruction. When the Lightning arrived, even veterans fell silent. Its size alone impressed. Its twin booms and gleaming canopy looked futuristic beside the blunt-nosed 109s. Lerch briefed the pilots who would face it in mock combat. "Do not underestimate the turn radius," he warned. "At high altitude, it keeps climbing while you fall." The first mock engagement took place above the Baltic coast. A pair of FW190A5s approached from below, their radial engines straining. Lerch throttled forward, the turbos whistling as the Lightning surged upward. Within seconds, he was above them, rolling into a dive that placed the Germans squarely in his gun sights. Of course, the guns were empty. This was data, not battle. But on the ground, the observers marked the outcome. Advantage Lightning? The report that followed reached Oberst Rosarius himself. It described the P-38 as superior in sustained climb, superior in dive recovery, stable gun platform. Weaknesses were noted too. Compressibility near 800 kilometers per hour, heavy control forces at speed. But the overall verdict unsettled the evaluators. The machine they mocked as American excess was proving the better design. In Berlin, engineers from Daimler-Benz and Junkers studied the findings. Could a German twin-engine fighter match the Lightning? The Me-410 Hornisse was the closest analog, yet its performance lagged. Its mechanical superchargers could not sustain power beyond 7 kilometers, and its range was half that of the American. Someone suggested revisiting a shelved idea, turbo supercharging for the DB603 engine, but the proposal died quickly. Germany lacked the nickel and chromium for turbine housings. Factories already rationed the alloys needed for the jet program. Meanwhile, Lerch continued flying. Each sortie pushed the captured aircraft deeper into German understanding and deeper into its own exhaustion. Replacement parts had to be fabricated by hand. Fuel of the correct octane was scarce. The engines coughed on synthetic substitutes. Yet still, the Lightning flew, a mechanical ambassador of an industrial world the Reich could not reach. One afternoon, Lerch landed after a high-altitude run and found Dr. Schelp waiting on the tarmac. The scientist had just come from Peenemünde, where rockets clawed at the upper atmosphere, and the new Me-262 jet waited for production. Schelp examined the Lightning's engines, the soot lines along the turbo housings. "You see," he said quietly, "this is what we are fighting against. Not their pilots, their factories." Within weeks, the P-38 was sent south to Wernicken, closer to Berlin, where bomber interception tactics were being tested. There it flew mock sorties against B-17 formations, allowing German radar operators to study its profile. The data proved invaluable. So did the lesson that no technical miracle would reverse the course of the war. The Americans were already producing new variants. The P-38J, the L, while Germany struggled to repair the damage from nightly raids. By the winter of 1944, the Lightning still bore its German crosses, though its paint was fading and its engines tired. It had survived longer behind enemy lines than many of its kin had over Europe. The records show its final flights logged in early 1945. After that, silence. Some say it was destroyed during an Allied bombing raid on Rechlin, others that it was scuttled to keep it from capture. Its remains, if any, were lost in the rubble. Yet its legacy endured in the papers it left behind. Hundreds of pages of data that told a story no propaganda could erase. For the men who tested it, the P-38 became a symbol of both admiration and warning. A reminder that innovation unshackled by politics could outpace genius constrained by ideology. When the war ended and the Allies occupied Rechlin, they found those documents neatly filed, stamped Geheim. Among them lay Lurch's final remark, penciled in the margin of a performance chart, an aircraft of another age, built not for a single battle, but for the endurance of war itself. The Lightning had shown them what was possible, and in doing so, it had shown them what was lost. The captured P-38 Lightning was gone from Rechlin now, but its echo lingered in the hangars. What the engineers had seen could not be unseen. Its power plants, its alloys, its design philosophy, every detail was a mirror held up to Germany's own industrial limits. In the heart of the Reich's war machine, the Luftwaffe test centers and engine works had begun a desperate rhythm. Blueprints multiplied faster than metal could be smelted. In underground halls near Stuttgart, in tunnels bored into salt mines, men in oil-stained coats worked beneath the unending hum of machinery. There were no longer enough skilled machinists. Boys barely out of school and foreign laborers from occupied lands filled the gaps. The Daimler-Benz factories that had once prided themselves on perfect tolerances now fought a losing battle against shortages. Each new directive from Berlin demanded the impossible. More power, less weight, fewer materials. Engineers wrote notes in the margins. Quiet protests disguised as equations. Alloy substitution will reduce lifespan by 60%, one line read. No one dared cross it out. Deep inside a testing hall at Unterturkheim, a prototype DB603 engine roared against its restraints. Flames licked from the exhaust stacks as technicians recorded the temperatures. The man overseeing the run, Dr. Karl Bauer, watched the gauges climb past red. He knew the numbers were lies, the metal was already failing. The nickel-steel bearings had been replaced by softer carbon steel. The engine would survive the test perhaps, but never 1,000 hours of flight. Across the hangar, pinned to a corkboard, hung photographs, the P-38's power plants, the smooth turbines of its turbochargers, captured on film before the aircraft's departure. Each photograph was an indictment. The Americans had mastered precision metallurgy decades ahead of Germany's strained industry. The General Electric turbo superchargers on the Lightning were more than machines. They were the triumph of stable supply lines, research, and unbroken production. The Germans had the theory. They had the minds, but they lacked the metals. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's leadership pushed forward new projects to close the gap. The Ta-152, the Do-335, and the jet-powered Me-262. Each was a masterpiece in isolation, yet none could be built in numbers large enough to matter. The engineers knew it, even if the generals would not admit it. "One perfect engine," Bohr once said to a colleague, "cannot fight 1,000 imperfect ones." In the workshops, the sense of exhaustion had settled deeper than the oil on the floor. Bombing raids came almost nightly. Lights flickered. Walls shook. When the sirens wailed, men simply kept working, trusting the roof to hold. Outside, columns of smoke rose from the foundries, black pillars marking the slow death of an industrial empire. In Augsburg, Messerschmitt engineers were re-examining the Lightning's flight data. One of them, Dr. Voldemar Voigt, was struck by its stability and dive recovery, a performance unmatched by any Bf-10-9. He began sketching modifications for the Me-262's control surfaces, borrowing lessons from the American design. In secret, German technology was beginning to learn from its enemy, but imitation could not replace production. For every P-38 the Americans built, Germany managed perhaps one-fifth of a comparable aircraft. The Reich's steel output was crippled by Allied bombing, and its aluminum reserves were vanishing. Engineers resorted to creative desperation, wooden wing spars, composite fuselages, recycled parts. They called it Ersatzbau, substitute construction, and it became the silent emblem of a nation running out of time. In the last months of 1944, as the front lines retreated westward, a small team of engineers at Rechlin revisited their old notes from the captured Lightning. One of them, Friedrich Linden, opened the folder marked T2-512. He reread the lines describing the turbochargers' efficiency at high altitude and whispered to a colleague, "If we had this in 1940, imagine." The man beside him didn't answer. There was nothing to imagine anymore, only to endure. When the Allied bombers returned, the workshops shuddered again. Shelves collapsed, engines toppled, paperwork scattered. Among the wreckage, someone found a singed report stamped, Vergleich, P-38 versus Me-410. The pages were half burned, but one sentence was still legible. Their technology advances not because they must win, but because they believe they can. That line, more than any figure or diagram, told the truth that every German engineer already knew. The war had become a contest of belief as much as machinery. By early 1945, the once proud workshops stood in silence. Many of their machines had been dismantled and buried. Others were seized by the advancing Allies, who found crates of incomplete engines, stacks of research, and notebooks filled with equations that would later fuel the jet age. When the war finally ended, the men who had studied the captured Lightning were scattered. Some captured, some recruited, some vanished into history. Yet in their memories, one machine remained, that silver twin-boom aircraft whose turbines sang with a sound they could not reproduce. In a way, the P-38 had done more than reveal American superiority. It had shown German engineers the boundary between genius and industry, and the price of a system that demanded miracles from men who no longer had the means to build them. The workshops had been their battlefield, and in that battlefield, the Lightning had won. In the final winter of the war, the wind over Germany carried more than the chill of defeat. It carried the sound of the future. From the skies came a new roar, not the hum of pistons, but the shriek of jets. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had taken flight. For the Luftwaffe engineers, it represented both triumph and tragedy, proof that their science could still reach beyond imagination, yet too late to alter the course of history. At Lechfeld Airfield, technicians huddled in frozen hangars around the prototypes. Many of them had once examined the captured American Lightning. Now they saw in the Me-262's sleek frame the evolution of everything they had learned. Twin engines mounted low, streamlined nacelles, and airflow perfected through bitter experience. In their notebooks, some drew parallels. Twin boom efficiency observed in P-38, applied conceptually to airflow studies. Turbo supercharging lessons influenced jet compressor ratios. But even as the Me-262 took to the air, its brilliance was haunted by the same old ghosts: shortages, politics, and time. The turbines that powered it, the Jumo 004s, were fragile creatures. Built from poor alloys, they lasted barely 25 hours before disintegrating. The engineers knew why. They had seen what the Americans could forge: the heat-resistant alloys, the precision-cast turbine blades that never cracked. Germany had none of it left. In underground workshops near Nordhausen, jet engines were assembled under torchlight by forced laborers. Each machine was a compromise between design and survival, between ambition and collapse. Above them, the Allied bombers returned again and again, erasing months of work in hours. Willie Messerschmitt, still unbroken in spirit, insisted that his jet would turn the tide. But those who had seen the P-38's engine knew better. They had touched the truth months before, when they saw the Lightning's turbines spin effortlessly, powered by the industry of a continent unscarred by war. In Rechlin's last surviving hangar, a small group of engineers met one evening as the front crept closer. On a table lay fragments of both worlds: a damaged Me-2 62 turbine blade, cracked from heat stress, and beside it, a piece of an Allison V-1710's supercharger impeller, retrieved from the remains of the captured P-38. The American metal still shone under the lamp. The German one was blackened, brittle, and worn. They said nothing for a long time. Then one of them, Dr. Hermann Oestrich, quietly murmured, "This is what freedom makes." It was not a political statement. It was an engineer's confession, the acknowledgement that creativity demands air to breathe, and theirs had been suffocated by fear and command. By 1945, as the Allies advanced from both east and west, the race for the future became a race for survival. German scientists packed their blueprints into crates, hiding them in barns, tunnels, and salt mines. The Me-262s that remained were scattered to fields and forest clearings, and in the ruins of Rechlin, a few technicians burned what they could not carry. Among the papers that turned to ash were test reports on the P-38 Lightning, the aircraft that had quietly inspired so many of their final efforts. When the war ended, American and British intelligence teams, the T-Forces, swept through the remnants of the Reich. They found laboratories buried beneath rubble, half-assembled jets, and shelves of captured Allied components meticulously labeled in German handwriting. One officer leafing through the files paused at a document stamped Feingerat T2-512 P-38F Lightning. He smiled faintly. "So," he said, "they were studying us, too." In the months that followed, the surviving engineers were divided by fate. Some were taken west to work under Operation Paperclip, contributing to the next generation of aviation in America. Others vanished into Soviet research centers, their knowledge repurposed behind a new Iron Curtain. But wherever they went, the story of that captured Lightning followed them. The moment they realized that technology, like freedom, cannot be commanded. It must be cultivated. In the years after the war, when jet engines matured and the skies filled once again with the sound of progress, those who had survived remembered the day they first lifted the P-38's cowling. They remembered the smell of the oil, the gleam of the turbine, and the quiet understanding that Germany, for all its brilliance, had fallen behind not in knowledge, but in spirit. History would later record the Me-262 as a marvel of engineering. But to the men who had lived it, the greater revelation had already come from an American aircraft that landed by mistake in Italy 2 years earlier. That machine, der Gabelschwanzteufel, had shown them the future. And by the time they reached for it, the war had already taken it away. The race for the future was over. The age of the jet had begun.